This is the second part of the lecture for Chapter 3, and we're looking at energy here and the different forms of energy usage. So the primary, or one of the primary uses of energy would be aerobic, in which oxygen is involved in the process. So this is typically how you and I respirate or use up energy. And the second one listed on there is anaerobic, which would be the process of using up energy, which in an environment in which oxygen is not as plentiful. And some of the byproducts of this system would be methane. So cows obviously produce a lot of methane. Ethanol, which we could look at as far as a fermentation process. And this can be something as simply as making beer and wine or in making bread. Acetic acid, which if you're doing athletics, you can have I said acetic acid here, but actually it would be lactic acid, which is the same process. You could have lactic acid building up in the muscles. And then the last one on there was hydrogen sulfide. So those are some substances that can be produced in an anaerobic respiration, which means the absence of oxygen. So we mentioned this in the last chapter in a process as far as efficiency every step of the way. Let me get my little pointer going here. There we go. Every step of the way, you're going to lose heat. We're going from one type of energy into another. So it's impossible to not do that because of entropy. We're going to lose some heat energy, thermal energy, every step of the way. So biodiversity. Why? Why do we need biodiversity? Well, if you want to have medicines, a lot of our medicines typically will come from or originally from a substance in the environment. So when we lose biodiversity, we're actually losing some of our storehouse of materials that we can build stuff from. So nature over hundreds of thousands of years has been manufacturing all these different substances. It's to our best interest to keep these things around. Natural services. There's a big topic right now in regards to honeybees, that their numbers have been going down for years and years and years. And we're kind of getting concerned about this because they provide a service to us that we don't have to do anything about. They pollinate lots and lots of different plant substances that if they were not present, we would not, or we would have to do a service ourselves. So it's to our interest to keep this organism, honeybees, around. Next on the list would just be aesthetics. It's just a little more pleasing having a variety of things out there. So I've mentioned this a few times. If you're out on the highway looking out the window and all you see is corn, 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 mile after mile, it gets a little boring after a while. It's nice to have a variety of things to look at. So, some strategies in maintaining biodiversity. You have two different approaches here. You have an ecosystem approach and a species approach. I'm not going to go through these lists for each little part here, but I would suggest that this one here is a more holistic approach to the system. Keeping the system itself intact will enable any particular species within that ecosystem to survive, instead of our typical means, which is to just try to do whatever is necessary for that particular species. It's a lot easier to actually just look at the whole system instead of just a part of the system. So another little web or a connection of different types of organisms. And again, notice the connections that these guys have between each other. It's not necessarily linear. You have these different routes that we can go all along the way. But ultimately, as you kind of see, we have a very specific starting point, and no matter where you start outside of the sun, we all eventually end up in a breakdown system at the end, going back into the beginning of the system. Same idea hitting over here with an aquatic setup here. Notice you have your primary, well, I guess your primary consumers, going back and forth that ultimately lead up into the secondary consumers. So, what happens? How do we lose some of these different organisms? How do we mess up some of these different ecosystems? Well, what typically has happened, so we have some habitat destruction. So you can look at different places in the world where some organisms have lessened in numbers. You could look at some of the great apes in Asia and Africa. You could look at tigers, same idea, losing some of their habitats. Invasive species. We see this in the United States and, of course, everywhere else. But when we introduce one species that can outcompete some of the natural species, that will have an effect on the numbers. Pollution. Pollution can knock down the ability for a organism to survive in its ecosystem. Human population growth, just based on our numbers, we have been squeezing out different organisms in the environment. So bald eagles were much more plentiful until humans started coming in and, of course, hunting, and as far as pollution as well. And then over exploitation, just using too much of that particular organism. So overfishing in coastal areas has become a problem, and we're seeing a big issue with that. So 10% rule, this is the first time we've mentioned that. And it's not an absolute, but it's a good rule of thumb, is every time you go from a starting position, so if you just think as far as phytoplankton in the oceans, or a primary consumer to a secondary consumer, we typically only are able to utilize or get 10% of the energy that that substance actually, or organism, actually had within it. So we kind of see, looking at the very top of the food chain, if there was originally 100,000 energy units to start with, starting with phytoplankton, we're only getting 10 of that. So the main theme of this, and we really haven't gotten too far into that, is the lower on the food chain that you actually eat, less meats, more plants, the more energy there is for everyone. So if you want to talk about world hunger and how do we take care of the world populations, eating lower on the food chain pretty much solves that entire problem. This is something I found a little surprising when I first saw it, as far as the productivity based upon different parts of the United States. I would have thought that Michigan would have had a higher amount of productivity. The main areas are over here in the blue, so you can see over here in some of the Gulf states are really, really high. As you might expect, over in the desert areas, these are quite low. But Michigan, in kind of this yellowish area, we're not quite as productive as I would have originally imagined. And here's another little graphic. I'm going to go ahead and just leave those little blobs up there. Just in general, how different types of ecosystems are in their productivity. So we can kind of look at us. Where do we fall in here? We are a temperate forest, a deciduous forest. So we can look at our productivity. We're somewhere in about there, so a little less than the tropical rainforest, as you probably would imagine, but much, much higher than, say, a desert or woodland scrubland. And then we have these down here in the blue, which are the aquatic ecosystems. And you can see estuaries, which would be like in the Gulf Coast. Those are very, very productive, and then going down from there. So net primary production. This is where agriculturalists really try to maximize the net primary production. So that is things that actually go on out to us. So you think of an apple tree. We are trying to design apple trees, whether it's through genetic engineering or just through traditional breeding, that we try to get trees to produce the most fruit. So that is a means or a process in trying to maximize the net primary production, which again is based off this equation here, looking at respiration and what it initially produces through photosynthesis. All right, this is a pretty good spot to take a break, and we'll pick up the second part of the lecture here next time.